This is another graph that shows, or if you want, accentuates the fact that corporate bond yields typically rise during times of economic stress compared to US Treasury bonds. So this is how we measure the yield spread. The spread is always taken, what is the gap between the yield of whatever, the corporate bond yield in this case, to the US Treasury bonds, which means the risk-free interest rate. So as you can see, the spread is increasing during economic stress and it is shrinking during periods of calm. So this is a time frame from 1993 and 2004. Okay, there are a couple of events here. You have the Russian ruble crisis that is increasing the spread. You have the low-grade corporate bond risk premium, okay, and the high-grade corporate bond risk premium. This is the 2001 recession that took place in the US. So as you can see, this spread, the gap between the two lines, the blue and the red, the corporate and the US is always below, okay, because the risk there is much lower and therefore the yield is much lower. For corporations, the yield is higher simply because the risk is higher. And the spread is the gap between the two lines. So it is sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing. Here's another perspective of 30-year fixed rate mortgage versus 10-year treasury yield. Okay, that's another type of a spread. This is for different time period from November 72 all the way to November 2012. Okay, so as you can see that these two markets are highly correlated, but still there is always some spread simply because 30-year fixed rate mortgage are more risky than 10-year US Treasury yield. There is always a small gap between the two, but they are definitely highly correlated markets. This is a graph that explains the rising inflation. How is it bad news for government bonds, okay? So the red line represents the US Treasuries over 10 years, okay? That's the yield of US Treasury notes for 10 years. And the blue line is the US CPI inflation index, the consumer price index, which measures the inflation in the US. So as you can see that whenever the inflation comes down, the yield is relatively high. When the inflation, the CPI, as you can see, the blue line is coming down, the yield goes up, and vice versa. When the inflation goes up, you can see that the yield of US Treasury goes down at that point, okay? So generally speaking, you can see an overall trend, downward sloping trend for the red line for the US Treasury note, while the inflation is more volatile here. But once again, the general idea here, at least for that period of time from March 2006 until January 2017, you can see that the yield and the inflation they're negatively correlated. Okay, let's learn a little bit about the fixed income markets in Europe. So the European markets are comprised of many individual countries, which, by the way, this market is pretty volatile. So countries getting in, countries coming out. So for example, only recently we heard about the Brexit, that Great Britain would like to exit the European markets. But in any event, this creates all kinds of problems for measuring all kinds of indicators. But in any event, let's learn a little bit about those markets. So we can divide those European markets into different ways. We can measure the markets politically based on political systems. We can divide them to currencies. For example, euro currency versus other currencies. So despite the fact that Great Britain, for example, was and still is part of Europe, but they never adopted the euro currency. They always used the British pound as their currency. Switzerland, for example, despite the fact that it is in the core center of Europe, they never joined the European Union, and they preserve their own currency, the Swiss francs. Okay, they never adopted the euro currency. We can divide the euro market, the European market, by either one of them, politically currency, or by both of them together, or by all kinds of subdivisions. So for example, there are all kinds of regions within Europe that we can measure economic indicators for those regions separately. So we can speak about the Benelux countries that include Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, okay, the northern states, and all kinds of things like that. So there are more than one ways, like I said, to divide or assess and measure all kinds of economic indicators in Europe. The countries themselves have completely different debt attitude and behavior. Okay, you can look at two extreme examples, Germany versus Greece, for example. So while Greece is under a lot of debt, actually debt that in many cases they cannot even service the debt, they cannot pay back their sovereign debt, and they are getting more and more loans from the IMF, the International Monetary Funds, and from other countries. Germany is a big lender. They have a surplus of money and they are lending, by the way, in many cases to Greece. So there are different cultures, different attitude towards debt and sovereign debt in Europe also. So it's definitely not a homogeneous market. Here you can see a graph about the Eurozone bond yields, okay, divided to different countries, starting from Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Germany, Finland, and Austria. So you can see what happened to their yields over the years 2009, 2010, 11, and 12, okay, right after the financial crisis that many classified from 2007 to 2009. And you can see different events here. So here Greece is asking for more and more loans. They cannot pay back the debt, and the IMF keeps on rescuing them again and again. You can see a sharp drop here in the 10-year government bonds, Greece government bonds here in 2012. Okay, they are issuing bonds at a lower yield right now. The yield was almost 50% for Greece. Think about that. A yield of almost 50% per year, simply because everybody thought that they will default. This is a country that is essentially a default. They were not able to pay back the debt, but they were rescued again by the European countries and the IMF. Let's see what else can we learn here. This is a figure that explains the 10-year bond Eurozone yields also from January 1st to November 12, 2012. 2010, this is just for one particular year, so this is kind of a zoom in into the 2000 year. And you can see also the countries Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece. Ireland, by the way, is also in a lot of trouble. They have a lot of debt, but Greece is one of the countries that is definitely in a serious situation here. You can see how volatile is the yield in Greece, the green line, okay? And this is just in the year 2010. European bond yields, more examples for different time periods. This is for slightly later periods from 2010 all the way to 2014. You can see European bond yields for Germany, Ireland, Spain, France, Italy, and UK. Okay, so Ireland here, this is a graph that accentuates the problem in Ireland, that the yield is much higher. Okay, obviously that is a problem, because whenever a country is issuing bonds with higher yields, it means that they just have higher risk. So people assess them as a higher risk country. That's why they have to compensate their investors and pay higher yield. European high-yield bonds, what else can we learn from this graph? Let's see, European high-yield spread to worse than default rates, okay? So you can see different default rates for European countries. Let's see what we have here. All kinds of information that was issued about unrated bonds, triple C bonds, B bonds, and double B bonds. Anything more than double B, those are considered investment grade bonds. BB and below are junk bonds. So all of these are the amount of junk bonds or non-graded bonds, non-investment grade bonds that were issued by the European markets. Okay, you can see that in the year 2013, 14, and 15, there is a jump in the amount of low-graded bonds, okay, simply because they are in debt and they need to raise more money. Let's learn a little bit about the the fixed income markets in Japan now. So the savings and investment dynamics in Japan have shaped the fixed income market, in which individuals save through a single instrument, namely the government debt. Macroeconomic and social fundamentals in Japan have played a major role over the past decades through corporate deleveraging, aging population, and expanding government expenditures. So although Japan is a big market, it is still, I would say, suffer from all kinds of social and macroeconomic factors. So for example, the interest rate in Japan over the past couple of decades was reduced to extremely low levels, virtually 0%, sometimes even below that. Sometimes it was even at the negative numbers, like minus 0.1%. In other words, you put your money in the bank, you don't save anything, but the bank is actually charging you 0.1% per year for holding your money. The government did that on purpose in Japan in order to encourage people to spend more money rather than save. But it didn't help them, simply because when the interest rate is so low, this is part of the culture, people are more afraid that they will lose their job or something bad will happen to them because of this long-lasting recession, and as a result they do not spend and they prefer to save more despite the negative yield or the even 0% return that they get on their money. So that's a long-lasting problem in Japan, and it became part of their culture.